Before we begin, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy drifting off to forgotten corners of history. And tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? I read every one. Now. Close. Your eyes. Back to a place where the desert breathes beneath stone, where the sun doesn't set. It rules. And the wind carries whispers that sound like secrets carved into bone. Back to Egypt. Not the Egypt of polished museum halls or filtered travel reels, but a stranger Egypt, the one hidden behind curtains of gold leaf and temple shadow, the one where the gods wore the faces of jackals and crocodiles, and men called themselves gods so often they forgot they were ever mortal. This is where the Pharaohs lived, and where their lives, despite the gold and grandeur, were far from divine. Imagine the sun rising over Thebes, not in brilliance, but in burden. Its light doesn't warm, it exposes. The sandstone walls glow pale orange, but their inscriptions are warnings, not celebrations. Chariots roll through narrow streets, wheels whispering dust, and from every high wall, carved eyes seem to watch you. Because in this world, someone is always watching, even the gods. Especially the gods. You are not one of the workers, nor the scribes, nor even a priest. You are royalty, or close to it, a prince, a daughter, a niece, her wife. The blood of a pharaoh flows through your veins, but so does something else. Expectation, fear, legacy. Every step you take must honor the dead, please the gods, and ensure that your name, your precious trembling name, will be spoken for centuries after your body has turned to dust. Life in the palace is quiet but never peaceful. There is ceremony. Everything is ceremony. You wake before dawn not to stretch or smile or dream, but to be painted, draped in linen so thin it could tear from a breath. Perfumed not for pleasure, but to mask the scent of anxious sweat beneath your ribs. You eat with gold utensils, but each bite is inspected, not for taste, for poison, because being close to power is like holding fire in your palm. You must not flinch, even as it burns. A royal daughter may live surrounded by rose oil and harp songs, but she also lives inside a trap. Marriage is not a choice. You will be given like a jewel to cement a peace treaty, or keep a general loyal, or soothe the ambitions of a half-brother who cannot inherit the throne. Your opinions are not needed. Your womb is, and you must smile, because every eye is on you. And a displeased face in the house of Pharaoh can be read as treason. A son of Pharaoh does not fare better. He is not raised. He is sculpted, educated by priests, trained by generals. He learns before age 10 how to hold a blade, recite prayers, spot betrayal. He learns how to kill and how to kneel, and most of all how to vanish his emotions beneath a still, godlike mask. If he weeps, even once, his tutors will call it a flaw in the divine order, and he will be corrected. The palace is cold despite the heat, not physically, but in its air. Rooms are vast, pillars tall, and servants glide through them like ghosts. You do not speak freely. Walls have ears, curtains hide spies, and even the sacred ibis that strolls through the garden may belong to someone else's god. There is no safety in splendor. When the high priest visits, you kneel. He does not. His eyes hold yours, unblinking, because he knows what you forget. He can undo you. A bad omen, a strange dream, a scroll misread, or read exactly as he wishes, and your future shifts like Nile mud beneath a flooding bank. Even the pharaoh treads carefully near the temples, Because kings can be buried, but gods must be fed. And the priesthood knows this, better than anyone. One night, you dream of water, but not the Nile. A black river, still, silent, flowing upward. When you wake, you do not speak of it. Dreams are dangerous. Too many have disappeared for less. So you offer incense, you whisper to a statue, and you smile, always you smile, even as your ribs ache from shallow breathing, even as the sun paints your room with hieroglyphs shaped like warnings, even as a beetle crawls from a crack in the wall, and you wonder absurdly if it's come to deliver a message. Because here, in the house of Pharaoh, even beetles are sacred. Even silence speaks, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is ever as it seems. The desert wind didn't care who you were. It scraped palace walls the same way it carved nameless tombs. It whistled through alabaster columns, slipped under gold-plated doors, and whispered its dry warnings to the most powerful men alive. Pharaohs, god-kings, and yet they were afraid. You see, the life of a pharaoh didn't begin with birth. It began with a story. A mother dreaming of divine light, a hawk flying over the river at the moment of conception, a midwife seeing an ibis in the blood. Myths woven quickly, fast enough to make the boy more than human before he could even speak. He was not allowed to be a child. He was not allowed to be ordinary. He was the son of Ra. He was Horus in flesh. He was the divine throat through which the gods would whisper justice. But what if he stuttered? What if he blinked too often? What if his hands trembled when holding a reed? Then the priests would whisper something else, something colder, because the priests did not work for the pharaoh, they worked for Egypt, and Egypt didn't forgive weakness. From the moment he could walk, he was watched, by scribes, by servants, by statues with eyes that followed you even in the dark. He learned the names of every god by the age of 5. He was taught how to hold a crook and flail, not as tools, but as symbols. The crook, to guide. The flail, to punish. They weren't decorative, they were instructions. Even his sleep was scheduled, incense at dusk. 2 guards at the door. A cup of lotus tea cooled to a specific temperature. If he dreamed, he was expected to remember. And if he forgot, the high priest would dream on his behalf, but what the gods wanted, it wasn't always clear, and when crops failed or floods swallowed the wrong fields, someone had to be blamed. Pharaohs were gods, but even gods could bleed, and some bled early. There were whispers of a boy king who ruled only 1 season before vanishing beneath the temple of Sobek, not killed, hidden, because the gods had changed their minds, because the omens had shifted, because his stutter had grown worse, and his shadow had stretched longer than it should have. No tomb was built, no names were carved, he was erased, and the next boy wore the same rings, sat on the same throne, a new god, same guards, different eyes watching from behind the curtains. By age 10, a pharaoh had learned not to trust smiles. Too many people bowed too deeply, held their praises too long. He began to see motives in every offering. A basket of figs might mean loyalty, or it might mean bribes or poison. So he didn't eat from baskets anymore, only from silver plates prepared by eunuchs who had no children to conspire for. The royal food was tasted by others first, sometimes cats, sometimes slaves. It was a privilege, they said, to taste what the pharaoh might taste, to die for him if the gods demanded it. Marriage came early. By 12, he was wed. Usually to a sister, sometimes to a cousin, because royal blood was too sacred to mix with common veins. even if it meant children born with bent spines or strange skulls. The priests would say those shapes were divine, that the gods had twisted the flesh to make room for extra spirit, and the sculptors, they obeyed. The statues always showed symmetry, smooth limbs, perfect postures, because the truth wasn't carved in stone, only power was. The harem was introduced by 13, not for pleasure, for legacy. Pharaoh without heirs was a curse, so the women came, hundreds in some reigns, not all seen, some never left their chambers, but all were watched, and any child born, any whimper in the night, was recorded, weighed, catalogued. If it breathed wrong, it vanished, because succession could not risk uncertainty, and because some priests still remembered what happened when Egypt had too many kings. By 15, paranoia had settled into his bones. He trusted no sandals but his own, no ink but what he ground with his own hand. He'd watched advisors turn into traitors. He'd heard the stories of sons killing fathers, brothers stabbing brothers in the perfume-scented dark. He'd learned to sleep with one eye open, one knife near the mat, and one prayer whispered in Coptic, not because he believed it, but because it might buy him one more hour, one more sunrise. At sunrise he bathed in oils infused with resin from Nubia, not for scent, for proof. The oils turned black when exposed to certain poisons, so he watched the water carefully. Any change in color, and the whole bathhouse would be burned. He knew how to punish. He had to. Mercy was remembered as weakness, and weakness meant assassins. Even his crown was a lie. It looked like one piece, elegant, powerful, but in truth it was two. The red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, forced together like feuding brothers who'd agreed to share a coffin. He wore them both, and the weight gave him headaches that lasted days. But he couldn't remove it. To do so was to unmake the illusion, and the illusion was the only thing keeping knives at bay. He gave speeches from behind screens. His voice was amplified by clay horns. No one saw his face, only the mask, the same mask they placed on statues, on paintings, on coins. A single face for all seasons, unchanging, ageless, until it wasn't. Because death did come, even for God, sometimes from infection, sometimes from a brother's ambition, sometimes from a priest's whisper hidden in the hem of a robe, and when it came there was no crying, only planning. The body was salted, wrapped, anointed. The tomb was already built. It had been dug since the Pharaoh was 6, because in Egypt your real life began after death, and your only hope of peace was that those who buried you believed you had earned it. The palace halls did not go dark when a pharaoh died. They went silent. Silence was more sacred than mourning. Grief was not a performance, not in the early hours. There was no weeping, no tearing of linen, no flutes playing yet, just stillness. The body was moved quickly, never publicly. Wrapped in fine linens, head covered, hands folded over the chest, and all around the priests prepared, not just for burial, but for judgment. Because in Egypt, dying was not the end. It was the beginning of an even more terrifying journey. The embalming table was long, flat, and cool to the touch, carved from polished stone, washed with oils, stained by centuries of secrets. The pharaoh's body would be stripped with care, each amulet removed, each token passed to the high priest, who decided which would return to the tomb and which would quietly vanish into temple vaults never spoken of again. The heart was weighed, literally removed and placed into a sacred jar, then the liver, the lungs, the stomach, the brain, that soft, slippery organ of memory, one was not kept. It was pulled through the nostrils with a bronze hook, discarded like a useless root, because to the Egyptians it was the heart that thought, the heart that felt, the heart that would be judged. For 40 days the body dried, wrapped in natron salts, laid in a tilted bed, its fluids draining slowly into bowls no one ever touched again. In this time, no pharaoh was spoken of by name. He was simply he who has gone west, because to name the dead too soon was to risk calling them back before they were ready, and the dead, especially pharaohs, did not always return kindly. Servants, meanwhile, prepared the tomb, not just cleaned it, rehearsed it. Each room was walked through, each chamber lit with lamps made of sheep, fat and cedar wicks. Scrolls were read aloud, quietly, to awaken the protective spirits carved into the walls. They believed words had power, and a wrongly spoken spell could turn a guardian statue into something less forgiving, so each scribe rehearsed twice, once with ink, once with silence. Only then were the scripts etched into stone. Some tombs were false. Decoys, constructed miles away from the real resting place, filled with empty chests, broken statues, and cursed jars, all to mislead thieves. Because, even in death, a pharaoh had enemies. Some tomb raiders were peasants, some were palace insiders. One was rumored to have been a cousin. His hands were cut off before he reached the burial chamber. His tomb was left open to the sun, a warning in bones and dust. As the burial day neared, the court changed its clothes, white linen only, no color, no gold, and no perfumes except myrrh and kaifi, which burned from long-necked burners held by silent girls chosen from the temple for their clean bloodlines. The scent filled every corridor. Not to mask death, to welcome it. The Egyptians did not fear the dead, they feared the forgotten. The burial itself took place at night, always at night. The stars were thought to guide the soul, especially those in the belt of Orion, which aligned with the tombs in Giza and shimmered above Thebes like cold lanterns. The body, now wrapped head to toe, layered in linen soaked in resin, was placed inside a coffin, which was placed inside another coffin, which was placed inside another. 3. Coffins, one for the body, one for the spirit, one for the soul, all sealed in gold or painted wood. Inscribed with spells, warnings, and images of the journey ahead. Some included maps, hand-painted paths through the underworld, marked with beasts, trials, gates. Because death was not rest, it was work. The soul, they believed, broke into pieces. After death, the ka, the vital spark, the ba, the personality, which could leave the tomb and visit the living. The ak, the unified form that could enter the realm of gods. But none of these could travel safely without protection. So the tomb was filled with food, jars of beer, dried fish, and sometimes whole rooms of furniture. Beds made of ivory and leather. Chests filled with scrolls and sandals. Games with all the pieces laid neatly in place, waiting to be played again. Even tiny boats were included for river journeys in the afterlife, and statues of servants called ushabtis, carved in the pharaohs. Likeness or in miniature human form, ready to answer when Osiris called for labor. Some tombs held hundreds, each one enchanted with a spell to make it obey, because even in death pharaohs did not lift their own hands. The tomb doors were sealed with mud bricks and stamped with the royal seal. To break that seal was not just a crime, it was a curse, literal. Some tombs had inscriptions warning, "I will seize the neck of he who opens this, I will drain his blood into the sand." The warnings weren't always believed. But when 2 workers vanished during one burial, the others began placing small statues of dogs at the entrances. Dogs, they said, saw things men couldn't, and the jackal-headed god Anubis was always watching. Above. Ground. Life resumed, but slowly. The court remained in partial silence for 70 days. No festivals. No feasts. Only quiet offerings to the departed ruler, and whispered debates about who would follow him. Succession was never guaranteed, even with sons. Some generals held armies, some priests held secrets, and some queens held ambitions. But all pretended to wait until the official mourning ended. Then the power shifted quietly, violently, with or without consent. Meanwhile, underground, the Pharaoh's soul passed gates. According to the Book of the Dead, he would face 42 judges, each with a name, each asking a question. Did you lie? Did you steal? Did you take bread from a starving mouth? Did you raise your voice? Each question had only one safe answer. No, I did not. And if the judges believed him, he was allowed to approach the final scale. There his heart was weighed, balanced against a feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth. If the heart was heavier, it was fed to Amit the devourer, a creature part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, and the soul ceased to exist. But if it balanced, he could enter the field of reeds, where the air was always warm, the crops always ripe, and the river never ran dry. But no pharaoh, no matter how powerful, could be certain of this end, because truth was heavier than gold. It did not take long after the tomb was sealed for the living to forget the dead. Not truly forget, not names, not titles. Those remained carved in obelisks and sung in temple songs. But the human behind the crown, he faded quickly. Because Egypt could not afford to pause. The Nile rose and the Nile fell. Dates ripened and rotted. And somewhere beyond the painted chambers of the royal palace, the common people still worked under a sun that did not care who ruled. But inside the palace, everything changed. The new pharaoh, often a son, sometimes a nephew, once or twice a general pretending to be a cousin, was not so much crowned as consumed. The coronation was less about joy and more about fear. Not fear of crowds, not of failure, but of displeasing the gods. Because if anything went wrong, and if the incense burned too dark, if the ibis flew left instead of right, if a single line in the coronation hymn was forgotten, the entire ritual had to be done again. Secret, away from public eyes. The people would be told the pharaoh had entered a deeper communion, but the truth, he had wept in front of priests who showed no emotion, because behind the gold thread and lotus garlands, this boy, 15, maybe 17, was now the mouthpiece of Ra, and Ra was not always gentle. Before he could sit on the throne, he was purified, naked, silent, shaved from head to toe, bathed in river water, carried in jars sealed with scarab wax, then covered in oils thick with cinnamon and frankincense, and draped in leopard skin, the symbol of the Sem priest. He had to become more than mortal, even if it hurt, even if it smelled like something burning, even if the gods, watching from the lotus-painted ceilings, found fault in his heartbeat. After purification came proclamation. Trumpets made from silver rang out over the city. Dancers performed pantomimes of ancient battles. Poets read verses too old for meaning, but heavy with rhythm. Crowds gathered, not to cheer, but to see, to memorize his face, his posture, the way he raised his left hand before his right. Everything was studied, because if he was weak now, The omens would bloom like mold, and Egypt hated mold. He sat on the throne at last, high-backed, gilded, flanked by lion paws. The air was thick with dust, but no one dared cough. Before him stood offerings: milk, honey, beer, a living goose with its beak tied shut. Beside him the high priest of Amun, silent, unmoving, holding the crook and flail. When the priest placed those into the boy's hands, a whisper passed through the hall. The whisper said, "He holds them tightly." He holds them like he means it. That whisper saved lives and ended others. He spoke his first decree, usually something vague, something like, "Let harmony rise like the flood. Let the people know the gods smile." It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. If his voice wavered, if his lip trembled, a knife might begin sharpening behind the curtain, because pharaohs were not raised to rule. They were raised to endure, and endurance was a performance. Behind the throne stood his mother, sometimes a queen, sometimes a concubine, elevated by circumstance, always powerful. She wore no crown, just a vulture headdress and eyes that missed nothing. Some said it was the mother who truly ruled, for the first few years at least. Some said it was the priests. Some said no one ruled, that Egypt ruled herself, and pharaohs were merely reflections. But no one said it loudly. The first week of his rule was ceremonial: visits to the temple of Ptah, offerings at Karnak, midnight prayers in chambers so old the stone still remembered older names, and dreams, always dreams. Priests would demand them. "What did you see in your sleep?" If the answer was acceptable, a falcon, a pyramid, a glowing reed, the priest would smile and the child could eat. If the answer was wrong, a snake, a storm, a broken pot, fasting would be ordered. Punishment not for lying, but for dreaming incorrectly. In the second week came the scrolls. The scrolls were not for learning. They were for binding. Each one contained laws, treaties, names of enemies, records of dreams from the past 30 kings, and the boy had to read them aloud, because pharaohs were expected to remember. A mistake, even a small one, could mean exile for a scribe or worse, because knowledge in Egypt wasn't power, it was survival. He learned the names of plants that could cure and those that could kill. He learned how to mix ink that would not fade. He learned which gods to flatter when trade routes failed, and which ones to blame when disease crept in from the delta. He learned how to sit still for hours while the vizier whispered reports. 1. Village refused grain quotas. 1 shipment of lapis went missing. 1 priest was growing too popular among the bakers. The boy nodded, said nothing, and tried not to blink too much. Blinking was weakness, and someone, always, was watching. At night, he walked the halls of the palace, alone mostly, sometimes followed at a distance by guards trained not to speak, not to breathe loudly. The columns were carved with gods who had seen 100 pharaohs come and go. He asked them nothing. They answered with silence. Only the torches crackled. He began to notice things. How the head servant's daughter always stood a little closer. How the cat that slept by his door changed color 3 times in a week. How one statue, a minor god of sandstorms, seemed to move each morning. He stopped eating figs. He stopped drinking beer unless it came from his own farm. He dismissed the cook who spoke with a southern accent, and the steward who walked too quietly. No reason was given. None was needed. Pharaohs didn't explain. Pharaohs survived. In the 3rd week, he sat for the sculptors. They shaped his likeness from granite and limestone, smoothing his cheeks, broadening his shoulders, removing the slight curve of his back. They didn't ask his opinion, they asked the priest. The priest approved, because what mattered was not what the pharaoh was, but what he seemed to be. If the people believed in the statue, they'd believe in the man, and if they believed in the man, the gods might stay silent a little longer. By the time he turned 20, the boy had vanished, not literally. His feet still walked the marbled courtyards, his voice still gave commands, his profile still decorated temple walls. But the softness was gone, the wide-eyed wonder gone, the questions about stars and dreams and how long the Nile had flowed gone. In their place was calculation, measured speech, high-practiced stillness so complete it frightened even the godsman. He had become what the crown demanded, a presence, not a person. He wore the false beard of Osiris now, clipped tightly beneath the chin. Uncomfortable at first, but he no longer flinched at it. Like the throne, it hurt, but only if you let it. He moved through the palace with a silence that made doors open before him, not from sound, but from instinct. Servants learned to step aside without looking. The wrong glance could be interpreted as curiosity. Curiosity. As ambition. And ambition in the pharaoh's court was a form of treason. The vizier once asked him what troubled him. He did not answer. He simply touched the crook in his right hand. That was enough. The next morning the vizier was replaced, quietly, without fanfare. A new man stood in his place, older, stiffer, less curious. He never asked questions, only listened, only nodded. The court whispered that the former vizier had taken ill. But illness in the palace always smelled faintly of bitter almonds, and the crocodiles in the palace pools were well fed that week. Ruling was not issuing decrees, ruling was enduring ritual. Every day before the sun crested the palace walls, he was awake, not just out of duty, out of fear, because if the pharaoh didn't rise, the sun might not. That was what the priests said, and he believed them. Not as a child believes, but as a man who understands that belief is a kind of protection. So, he woke. He prayed. He stood still while servants dressed him, first in plain linen, then in golden chest pieces etched with cartouches and sun discs. He ate only after offerings were made. He drank only after chants were finished. He breathed only when the gods allowed it. The temples were many, too many. Each demanded presence, each demanded gold. Even the smallest gods, frog gods, wind gods, gods of broken pottery and desert air, demanded shrines. He nodded at each. He bowed to none. His father had bowed once, and then choked on a grape at a feast, or so they said. The pharaoh learned which gods preferred which oils. He learned how many steps it took to walk from the courtyard of Amun to the altar of Thoth without stumbling. He learned which priest could be trusted to whisper the right omens, and which one lingered too long behind closed curtains. That one disappeared. One morning, only his sandals were found, neatly placed at the edge of the Nile, as if he had walked into the water and become mist. He married. He had to. The queen was chosen not from love, not even from beauty, but from lineage. Her blood traced back to a dynasty lost 3 reigns ago. Her name matched the moon goddess, and most importantly, she did not speak too much. She bore him a son, then a daughter, then silence. She remained in her wing of the palace, surrounded by handmaidens and soft-footed eunuchs. Sometimes he visited. Sometimes they walked the garden paths together, never speaking, because love was a luxury, and pharaohs could not afford luxury, only legacy. But the birth of heirs did not ease his burdens, it deepened them. Now there was something to protect, and protection in Egypt was an unending task. He increased the guards, he changed his food tasters weekly. He ordered the tomb architects to begin work, not because he was dying, but because one should always be ready. The workers carved halls deep beneath the desert stone, chambers for his heart, chambers for his sandals, chambers for his thoughts, all sealed in silence, all kept secret, because death listened, and the Pharaoh had many enemies. He held court once a week, a ritual parade of farmers, builders, merchants, soldiers. Each brought tribute, each bowed deeply. He said little, but his silence spoke volumes. A flick of his eye could earn a blessing. A twitch of his finger could end a life. Once a brickmaker stumbled during presentation. His scrolls spilled across the limestone floor. He wept. The Pharaoh simply stared. No words, no gesture. The man was removed. His name was never spoken again. The bricks he made were repurposed into a wall in the royal latrines. Poetic justice, the scribes whispered. But quietly, the older he grew, the more he trusted fewer. His generals were rotated. His scribes given assignments far from the palace. Even the gardeners were replaced annually. Too much familiarity, he believed, was a crack in the throne. He turned more to statues for counsel, to the faces in stone, the falcon-eyed gods, the jackal, the lioness. They never lied. They never forgot their place. Dreams came harder, not the dreams of children, but sharp flashes of symbols, a crocodile in a cage, a pyramid upside down, a heart eaten by ants. He stopped sleeping in his chambers, moved instead to a new room each night, sometimes in the palace, sometimes in the temples, once in a tomb not yet his. He said it was research, but the priests knew. He feared the dark, because the dark in Egypt was never empty. He began commissioning statues of himself with exaggerated features, broader shoulders, larger hands, to appear divine. But behind the stone, his real form thinned. He rarely ate. He drank only pressed figs and goat's milk. His hands trembled when he signed. Papyrus, but no one dared notice. They only praised the elegance of his penmanship, even as his signature shortened each month, even as the ink grew lighter. One evening, as the lotus lamps dimmed, he asked the temple cat a question. "Do they remember who I am?" The cat blinked. Somewhere in the distance, a scribe copied his deeds in red ink, but no one wrote down that question. It was not considered holy, only human, and humanity had no place in the life of a god-king. There came a time, as there always does, when the air around the Pharaoh grew still. Not the stillness of peace, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of anticipation. A quiet held by those who watched too closely and by those who spoke too little. The guards bowed lower. The priests chanted longer. The stonemasons paused before carving his name, unsure whether to leave space. For the date of his death, and though he said nothing, he felt it too, like sand under the skin. Something was ending. It began with the coughing, soft at first, dry, dismissed as dust from scrolls, or the air stirred by the ibis in the temple courtyards, but it lingered, came at night, then at noon, then during prayers. At first he tried remedies, the ancient kind, milk boiled with crushed date pits, ointments of honey and barley, wine steeped with lotus root. Nothing worked, and so he turned to silence. If he did not speak of it, perhaps it would pass. But illness in Egypt had a way of blooming like mold behind a painted wall, beautiful from a distance, deadly up close. The court physicians were summoned, not one, but 7. They came cloaked in linen, bringing jars of ground malachite and knives made of copper polished to a god's reflection. They examined him in whispers, listened to his breath, studied his urine in translucent bowls. One physician, bold or foolish, suggested bloodletting. The Pharaoh did not blink. He only raised his hand, and the physician was escorted out, not of the room but of the palace. By sunrise the physician's house was empty. Even his dogs were gone. He walked less, no longer pacing the length of the courtyard with slow command. Now he was carried, a litter draped in white linen, flanked by perfumed attendants. He protested at first, quietly, but eventually, even resistance, felt heavy. He began to see things, not hallucinations, not madness, just fragments. A goat-headed man in the corner of his chambers, a woman made of reeds watching from the fountain, the eyes of Horus blinking in the mosaic floor. He said nothing, because pharaohs were not allowed to be haunted, and yet he was. At night he began asking for stories, tales of previous kings, of gods disguised as beggars, of plagues that spared only the righteous. The priests obliged. They told him about Menes, who tamed the crocodile, about Khufu, who spoke to stars, about Thutmose, who turned jackals into gold. But none told the stories of those who died suddenly, or those whose tombs were robbed, or those who were buried with false names to prevent curses. Those stories were forbidden, too true, too close. One night, during a full moon, he asked his scribe a question. "When I die, who decides what I become?" The scribe hesitated, then answered carefully, "The priests shape your soul's passage, the artisans shape your legacy, the people shape your memory." The pharaoh smiled faintly. "So none of it is mine." The scribe bowed. No reply could be given, because to admit it was true would be to admit he was no god, only a man in a costume made of dust and fear. He ordered the tomb preparations to accelerate. More rooms, more guards, more curses carved into the walls. He added a false chamber, a replica of his treasury, complete with clay jars painted to look like gold, to mislead robbers. Or gods, perhaps. Even in death, he did not trust. He requested one final statue, not the kind for temples, not the kind for city gates, but for himself, to be placed at the foot of his tomb, to watch the rising sun. He gave specific instructions. Do not smooth the face. Do not broaden the shoulders. Do not hide the lines or cracks. Make it look exactly like me, as I am, not as they want to remember. The sculptor hesitated, but obeyed. When the statue was finished, he stared at it a long time, then ordered no one else be allowed to see it, ever. It was covered in linen. Buried alone, a mirror buried beneath a mountain of gold. He saw his children less, not by choice, but by rhythm. They were young still, raised in courtyards he no longer visited, tutored by women who smelled of papyrus and rose oil. Sometimes he sent them gifts, a carved toy, a beaded bracelet, a scroll written in his own hand, short, poetic, distant. They sent back drawings. He did not display them, but he kept them, folded into a hollow niche in his throne, where no one could see. But he could feel. In his final season, he asked to see the Nile one last time, not from a balcony, from the shore. The guards protested. The priests fasted. The queen wept, but the pharaoh insisted. At dawn they carried him, no fanfare, no crown, only silence. The banks were quiet. The reeds leaned into the breeze. A heron walked near his feet, unafraid. He watched the water flow and whispered, "It never stops. It never stops for anyone," then turned away and never returned. He died a week later. They said it was peaceful. They always say that. The city fell into ritual. Trumpets made of bone called for mourning. Wails echoed in temple halls. Perfume was burned until it sickened the air. The embalming lasted 70 days, the burial 1. He was sealed beneath the earth with gold and honey and prayers, his mask perfect, his tomb massive, his statue hidden. But the man, the Yi. Man was gone long before his body cooled. Above ground Egypt continued. The river rose. The scribes wrote new names. The statues remained still. And in the quiet places people whispered his name. Not in reverence, but in curiosity. Not as a god, as a riddle. Because the disturbing life of a pharaoh was not that he ruled so many, but that in ruling all he belonged to none, not even himself. They said the throne passed smoothly, that the priests anointed the new pharaoh in gold oil and lotus smoke, that the nobles pledged loyalty without hesitation, that the old king's tomb sealed quietly without tremor. But truth lives elsewhere. In the silence between chants, in the glance of a young prince suddenly renamed God, because no one becomes pharaoh. They are swallowed by it. He had been a boy just days before, a boy who chased ibis through temple gardens, who watched sculptors chip gods into limestone, who once fell asleep under a fig tree and dreamed of walking barefoot on the moon. Now that same boy knelt in the great court, crowned in the twin serpent diadem, while priests painted stars across his bare chest in crushed lapis. His mother wept silently, not for pride, but for the child she'd never see again. The crown was too heavy. It always was at first, but the boy did not complain. He kept his face like the statues, still, soft, unreadable. He walked through the palace with his new name on. Every tongue, not his birth name, that was forgotten. His new name meant everlasting sun, but he felt more like shadow. The ghosts of his father's rule clung to every wall. Servants still bowed to empty doorways. Guards still paused when they reached the old king's hall. The throne itself creaked as if resisting a new weight, and in the scribe's corner a scroll sat half-written. The story of the old pharaoh, never finished. No one dared touch it, not even him. He met with the priests. They called him divine. Son, eye of the horizon, chosen vessel. But when he spoke, they corrected him, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to remind him he might be God to the people, but to them, he was still a boy. He nodded, learned, listened, but a seed of bitterness took root. Because gods, he thought, should not need permission. He walked the old paths, traced the names carved into temple walls. He found his father's image, perfect, eternal, standing beside Ra, offering incense to the sky. He stared at the stone. The features were familiar, but the eyes were wrong, too calm, too knowing. His father had never looked like that, not in life. He ordered the sculptors to remake it. They refused, politely, so he found others, foreign artists. From the coast, less bound by tradition, the new carving was softer, closer to how he remembered, not majestic. Human. It was defaced within the weak. He dreamed often, of sand swallowing cities, of lions weeping in the desert, of a child drowning. In ink, he woke drenched in sweat. Whispers always at the edge of hearing. He asked the high priest for interpretations. But the priest only smiled. The gods speak in riddles. Do not trouble yourself. He did not ask again. Instead, he began writing the dreams down in secret, pages tucked behind the tomb blueprints in his study. He changed the rituals, not many, just enough to feel different. He shortened the morning chants, allowed dancers at the evening feasts, banned onions from temple offerings. The priests protested quietly. The people, they didn't notice or didn't care. They still saw the crown, still bowed, still brought tribute. But he noticed. The old Pharaoh's seal began to fade from papyrus. His name carved more faintly in public walls. The past, once revered, was now background. He feared the same would happen to him. He summoned the tomb architects early, younger than his father had. But not as paranoid, or so he told himself. He asked for less gold, fewer rooms, more poetry on the walls. "When they find me," he said, "let them know I wondered." The chief architect hesitated. "Wondered what, my king?" He thought for a moment. "If any of it was real." The queen was chosen by the council. A cousin, beautiful, obedient, quiet. She arrived wrapped in white linen, eyes lined in kohl, lips sealed by duty. He did not love her. She did not expect it. They sat together on balconies, spoke of trade routes, shared bowls of pomegranate. Occasionally they laughed, but love, as always, was left out of the arrangement. A pharaoh's heart belonged to no one, not even himself. The city shifted under his rule. Merchants brought rarer goods. Foreign dignitaries arrived in peacock-colored robes. The scribes created new scripts, sleeker, more elegant. Change came slowly, like erosion, but it came. He allowed bronze mirrors in court, commissioned artists to paint more lifelike scenes. He even considered allowing his statues to show age, wrinkles, slumped shoulders, tired eyes. The court gasped. "You will look mortal." He smiled. "I am." But the statue was never finished. The sculptor vanished before the second sitting. He wandered. The palace gardens alone, listened to the frogs sing in moonlight, watched moths spin beneath torches. He spoke to the cats, to the wind, to the memory of his father. "Did you ever feel real?" No answer came, only the rustle of papyrus leaves and the faint smell of resin from the embalming halls nearby. One morning, a child approached the throne, slipped past the guards, knelt, held out a single blue scarab. "For you, Divine One." He took it, closed the child's hand around it. "Keep it. It's yours." The court panicked. The child was pulled away, but he watched him go, and for the first time, he felt more than a symbol. He felt present. But presence in Egypt was dangerous. Stories began. Whispers of rebellion, rumors that he was weakening tradition. He heard them all, felt the weight gathering. He tightened court circles, rotated advisors, buried scrolls in secret chambers. He smiled more often, but his eyes stopped blinking, even in portraits. At night he still dreamed of sandstorms, of lost names, of being buried alive in gold. He stopped sleeping in the same room twice, and in one forgotten hallway he found the hidden statue of his father, the real one, the one never displayed. He looked at it for hours, then ordered it moved. Not to the tomb, but to the palace entrance. Let them see, let them remember, let them fear. He sat in the Hall of Echoes. That was not its real name. It had once been called the Hall of 20 Columns, built during the reign of an ancestor he no longer remembered, a place meant for grand processions and royal declarations. But now, it was empty. The sound of his sandals echoed for what felt like minutes. Every word he spoke repeated back to him as if the past refused to let go. So he stopped speaking. Silence had become his new language. It was the only way to hear the truth. Advisors filled their scrolls with praise. Priests filled their mouths with prophecy. But in silence, the truth slipped out from behind their eyes, in the twitch of a cheek, the dart of a gaze, the stiff shuffle of someone who once knelt quickly, now slower. They were beginning to question him, and worse, they were beginning to pity him. He stared out at the city. From the roof of his palace he could see it all. The temple fires still burned. The markets still hummed. Children still played among broken columns and half-carved statues. But the sound felt distant, like watching someone else's dream. He no longer knew what belonged to him and what was simply borrowed. Borrowed from the people, from the gods, from the river that refused to stop flowing even as his heart grew heavier. One afternoon, he ordered the court historian to read aloud, not poetry, not sacred texts, but the exile lists, those cast out, those erased, those whose names were scratched from every wall and clay tablet as if they had never lived. He listened in silence, and when the reading was done, he asked a single question: "And who remembers them now?" The historian said nothing, because the answer was clear: only those willing to ask. He began visiting the tomb chamber again, his own. The workers had made good progress. The walls were now etched with celestial charts, the floor polished smooth like the river's surface, the ceiling painted black and speckled with silver, to resemble the sky he rarely saw. But it was the door he paid most attention to. This should not open easily, he told them. It must feel final. They nodded, but none dared ask why a living man spoke so easily of his own end. He requested a new chamber be added, not for gold, not for scrolls, but for a single item, a statue, half the height of a man, carved from obsidian, smooth and featureless. "What does it represent?" the sculptor asked. "Absence," were the pharaoh replied. The statue was sealed inside the tomb before even he could see it complete. The priests were furious. They feared curses, feared confusion, feared that emptiness once acknowledged would spread. He ignored them. He had begun to understand something they hadn't, that what is left unsaid often lasts longer than what is spoken. His queen bore him a child, a son. The court rejoiced. Festivals were declared. Priests read omens in the liver of oxen and found only blessings. He named the boy something simple, a name not tied to gods or conquest or the sun. Just a name, one he could whisper without it echoing. He visited the child at night, sang old songs half forgotten from his own childhood, traced invisible stars on the boy's forehead with trembling fingers, and once, just once, he told the child, "You do not have to become me." The nurses said nothing, but the words hung in the room like incense. He stopped attending court ceremonies, sent envoys in his place, or presided behind veils. The people speculated, whispers of illness, madness, possession. But the truth was simpler. He had grown tired of being seen and never known. He returned to the temple of Osiris alone, no guards, no procession, just him, a lamp, and the scent of age. The statue of the god loomed in the dark, eyes blind, hands open. He stood before it for a long time, then whispered, "If you ever listened, now is the time to speak." Nothing, not even wind. He laughed. Not cruelly, but like a man realizing something too late. He turned, and as he left he said, Perhaps silence is your answer. From that day forward, his decrees changed. He ordered temples to allow commoners beyond the second gate. He freed 1,000 workers from forced labor. He banned the killing of cats, not for worship but for kindness. He renamed cities after virtues, not after himself. His advisors panicked. "You are unraveling tradition," they cried. He smiled. "Perhaps tradition has earned it." And then the omens began, or so they claimed. A red river in the north, a temple, roof that collapsed under clear skies, a crocodile born with 2 tails. The priests grew loud, the scribes frantic. Even the people began placing offerings at crossroads, old magic for uncertain times. But he remained still, not calm, just still, as if he had reached the bottom of a river and all the noise above could no longer touch him. He began composing his own funeral rites, unusual ones. He requested no mourners, no incense, no golden mask, just linen, silence, and a single line carved at the foot of his tomb. Here lay the doubts of a god. They tried to talk him out of it, but the order was sealed, signed in his own hand, and then, without warning, he vanished. One morning the palace awoke, and the pharaoh was simply gone. No body, no farewell, no note. His chamber was undisturbed, the bed still warm, the sandals by the door, a cup of wine half finished. The city froze. Some said he was taken by the gods, others said assassins. A few whispered he walked into the desert seeking something even the Nile could not give. But no one truly knew, only this. His tomb was found sealed and from the inside, and in it, no body, just the obsidian statue and the line he had chosen. Here lay the doubts of a god. The news broke like a whispered curse. First among the palace servants, a rumor passed between courtyards in the shadows of dawn. Then the temple guards learned, then the high scribes, then the priests, and before noon, the entire court stood, frozen before the empty throne. The Divine One had disappeared, not died, not slain, disappeared, vanished like a spirit, as if the gods had reached down and taken back what was theirs. And in a world where gods were everywhere, in walls, in wind, in flame, in sand, such things were not impossible, but still, no one was ready. The court assembled in the great hall. The queen sat veiled in white, her face unreadable. The child, barely old enough to speak, sat beside her, playing with the edge of his robe, unaware of the weight pressing down on the chamber. Like stone, the high priest spoke first. He recited hymns, blessings, assurances. He spoke of Ra's eternal eye, of the cycle of divine rule, of order returning after the tremble of change. But beneath his words was panic, because the gods had not taken this pharaoh. Of that he was sure. Gods do not leave behind sandals and half-finished wine. The tomb was opened carefully, ritually. The priests wore amulets against curses. Scribes recorded every step. Soldiers waited with drawn blades, though against what no one could say. Inside they found only what he had ordered, the obsidian statue, the single carved line. Here lay the doubts of a god, and dust. No body, no offerings, just absence. A silence so complete it echoed. The search began, discreetly at first. Servants were questioned, guards replaced, tunnels beneath the palace examined inch by inch, but no trace. Not in the city, not in the tomb, not even along the Nile. No fisherman saw a royal barge slip past. No village welcomed a stranger with royal eyes. It was as if the Pharaoh had stepped sideways into another world or become a story, and that more than anything terrified them, because in Egypt Stories were power, and uncontrolled stories could burn kingdoms. Already the people whispered. He lives among the stars now. He walks the duat, guiding the lost. He was never real, just a dream shaped like a man. The palace scrambled to seize the narrative. Statues were commissioned, new hymns written, a festival of remembrance announced. But it was too late. The silence had already taken root. His name became dangerous, spoken in hushed tones, then avoided, then scratched off walls. Priests debated whether to include him on the royal lineage. Some said yes, out of respect. Others refused. Out for fear. Because what if he returned? What if his disappearance was not death but judgment? The queen withdrew from public life. Some claimed grief. Others suspected guilt. She issued no decrees, gave no interviews, raised the child quietly behind heavy veils and thicker curtains. When asked of the Pharaoh's fate, she would only say, "He left when the world stopped listening," and closed the door. The boy grew quickly, too quickly, some whispered. He had his father's eyes, but not his silence. He asked questions, challenged tutors, demanded the right to visit the tomb his father had left behind. And when he was finally allowed, he stood before the obsidian statue for hours, not speaking, not touching, just watching. And when he returned, he said, "We will not build statues." That lie. The priests flinched. The scribes took notes. The court began to shift. Years passed. The memory of the vanished pharaoh dulled at the edges. His reforms were slowly reversed. Temples reasserted control, names recarved, but something lingered. A hesitation in the priest's voice during morning chants, a slight tremor when the throne room echoed too loudly, a recurring dream, shared by many, of a man in linen robes, walking through walls, his face obscured by sand. The boy, now nearly a man, kept his father's journals hidden and read them under candlelight while the city slept. One passage he read again and again. "If the gods are real, they will understand my doubt. If they are not, then my doubt is the truest prayer I have." He did not understand it, not yet, but it stayed with him, like a thorn that wouldn't heal. A scholar long ago had said that Egypt was a kingdom of stone and wind, stone for memory, wind for forgetting. And in time, both won. The vanished pharaoh's name faded from public scripts, his monuments dismantled, his likeness recarved into another's, but in private, in whispers, in the backs of scrolls and under floor tiles. He endured, because doubt once introduced never truly dies. It waits, sleeps, and one day it speaks again. The boy was 17 when the crown was placed upon his head. Too young, some said. Too haunted, others whispered. But the lineage was clear, and Egypt had endured stranger transitions. The coronation was solemn, no parades, no great hymnals, just quiet ceremony, as if the gods themselves were watching more closely than usual. As the priests chanted the ancient words, he stood still, unblinking. When the golden uraeus was pinned to his brow, he did not smile. And when the court cheered, he did not look up. He took a new name, not one tied to gods, not a name of conquest, but a name of stillness. Setepkenu, the chosen of silence. Some found it poetic, others found it unsettling, but none dared challenge it. The throne was no longer warm, it was cold, and he fit it perfectly. His first decree was not about temples or taxes, it was about ink. No decree shall be recorded in stone until it has survived 5 years in papyrus. The scribes blinked. But stone is eternal. They protested. Stone is a trap, he replied. We write truths in stone before we test if they survive the wind. No one argued again. He reformed the court quietly, surgically. The loudest advisers found themselves reassigned to distant provinces. The priests, who had shouted most about omens, were given sabbaticals. He surrounded himself with listeners, not flatterers, not believers, listeners. He claimed it was a strategy, but some said it was fear. Fear that his father's silence might return. This time in him. He visited the Hall of Echoes, the same empty chamber where his father once paced, now abandoned. Dust gathering in corners. He walked it slowly, measured, each step precise, then stood in its center and whispered, "I'm listening." No answer, only the sound of the stone remembering too much. He opened the royal archives, not just for scholars, but for anyone who could read. The priests called it blasphemy. The scribes called it chaos. But the people called it something else, hope, because for the first time they could read laws that governed them, understand decrees that changed their lives, and they began asking questions. That was what truly terrified the old court. He reinstated his father's forbidden line. Here lay the doubts of a god, but added his own beneath it. And here begin the doubts of a son. He had the lines carved, not in his father's tomb, but on the outer gate of the palace, so every visitor passed it, every envoy read it, every child memorized it before they could write their own name. He kept the obsidian statue, moved it to the heart of the palace, surrounded it with lilies and sand. Never explained its meaning. But each year, on the day of his father's disappearance, he sat before it alone until dawn. No guards, no scribes, just him, the statue, and the desert's whisper pressing against the walls. He banned funerary. Masks, let the dead be seen. Let their faces return to the dust with honesty. The mask makers protested. He gave them new roles, creating statues of unknown people to fill the empty plazas and remind Egypt of lives unrecorded. He called them the faces of the forgotten. His reforms sparked murmurs abroad in Nubia, in the Levant. Even in the far isles of the Aegean, traders brought tales of the silent pharaoh who ruled without shrines and asked to be remembered only for his absence. One foreign scribe called him the Ghost King. Another said he was building a nation of mirrors, but his people, they simply called him Kenut, stillness. In his 3rd year, a temple roof collapsed during repairs. 3 workers died. 2 priests were injured. The old court called it a sign. They begged him to hold a ceremony of cleansing, to offer sacrifices, to build a monument. Instead, he visited the site, sat with the injured, spoke with the workers, and at sunset, he addressed the crowd. The gods do not demand blood for every falling stone. Sometimes we build poorly, let's build better. The workers wept, the priests seethed, and Egypt shifted again, just a little. He passed a law. No decree may begin with the word eternal, because, he said, we mistake duration for wisdom. It seemed small, petty even, but soon scribes found themselves rewriting the language of empire. Not eternal peace, but honest peace. Not eternal harvest, but this season's good grain. And the people began speaking this way too, grounded, measured, like a kingdom waking from myth. He never remarried, never claimed godhood, never built a pyramid. When asked why, he said only, "I saw what they did to him." And the court understood. In the 10th year of his reign, the river Nile failed to flood. A famine threatened. Priests declared wrath. Merchants raised prices. Panic spread. He did not pray aloud. He did not build new temples. He opened the palace. Granaries shared every royal reserve and inscribed a line into a wall in the public square. The gods will return when the people do not go hungry. He aged early, lines carved deep around eyes too used to watching, hands that trembled not from fear but from memory. He began walking alone at night, without guard, without torch, just the moon and the sand. When asked why, he said, "Because that's where I might still find him," and no one asked again. As his life waned, he ordered one last construction, not a tomb, a garden, a vast one, spanning across the eastern courtyard of the palace, filled with nothing but date palms and silence. No fountains, no statues, only wind. He called it Nefeseshu, the beautiful breath. He asked that no plaque be placed there, no marker of him, just shade. And when he died, as quietly as he had ruled, his final request was found in a folded scrap of papyrus, placed in the hand of his most trusted scribe. It read, "Do not bury me where the wind cannot reach. I was a man. Let the dust have me." They honored it. His body was laid in a shallow grave at the edge of the city, where reeds met river, and the stars could still be seen, and beside it a small stone, uncarved. The garden remained. It was the only thing left untouched when the new regime swept in. Nefeseshu, the beautiful breath. They left it alone, not out of respect, but because no one knew what to do with it. There were no statues to deface, no inscriptions to recarve, no gods to overwrite, just trees, wind, and silence. It was the perfect memorial for a man who refused to be remembered. And yet he was. The new pharaoh, a cousin from a sidelined branch, was crowned with the full rites of tradition. He reinstated the old forms, declared the gods angry, rebuilt the priesthood, and ordered that all unofficial royal edicts be burned or buried. He offered sacrifices in public, commissioned hymns, promised the people they were safe again, and they clapped. But they did not cheer. The city watched in silence as the past was rewritten. The statue of the vanished Pharaoh's father, the one of obsidian, was quietly removed, not destroyed, just taken. Some said it was hidden in the catacombs below the temple. Others claimed it was sunk into the Nile, weighed with bronze. Either way, it was gone. The silence of the father was now a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. And yet, not all forgot. In the villages along the river, fishermen still told stories of the king who walked in linen and vanished. In desert way stations, caravanners remembered the law of the quiet pharaoh, no truth in stone unless it survives the wind. And in homes where grain was once shared freely during the famine, mothers still whispered prayers at night, not to the gods, but to a man they called the listener. The scribes, always the true guardians of memory, became careful. They did not record the name of the silent pharaoh in official ledgers, but in personal journals, in the margins of scrolls, in secret copies hidden under tiles, they preserved his voice. Lines like, "The wind does not forget even when the stone is erased. The gods cannot hear what the hungry will not say. I ruled not to be remembered, but to give memory back to others." And so he remained, not as a king, but as a question. Decades passed. Egypt changed again. The priests rose, then fell. Temples expanded, then crumbled. Pyramids were restored, then plundered. But still the garden remained. Neferseshu untouched, a quiet piece of rebellion at the heart of an empire built on shouting. Then came the drought, a great and terrible one. The Nile ran thin. Fields turned to dust. People fled the Eidai cities. The court turned inward, searching for answers in rituals and relics. But outside the palace walls, the people returned to the garden. They brought water in bowls, planted herbs between the date palms, sat in silence beneath the shade, and slowly they began to speak of him again, not as Pharaoh, but as Canute. Stillness, the man who fed them without prayer, who ruled without monuments, who asked only to be forgotten, but could not be. A scribe, born long after the silent Pharaoh's reigns, wrote, "He was the only king who left us nothing but breath, and that was the one thing we needed to keep going." Another wrote, "His name was a pause, and sometimes a pause is louder than a decree." These words were not inscribed in stone, they were copied quietly, hand to hand, memory to memory, like a breath passed between generations. In the temples, the high priests attempted to bury him again. They called him heretic, a ruler who weakened Egypt's divine foundation. They preached that silence was rebellion, that doubt was a disease. But even among them, younger acolytes read the forbidden scrolls by candlelight and wondered, what if the gods weren't deaf? What if they were simply quiet? Centuries blurred the edges. No one remembered exactly when the silent Pharaoh ruled, or which name he'd been born with, or where his grave lay hidden. But the idea of him persisted, in lullabies, in whispered advice. "Listen before you speak," mothers would say. "Even kings can vanish without blood," elders warned. And in the wind that blew through reed and ruin, his breath remained. Modern archaeologists would uncover fragments, a chipped bit of papyrus here, a faded carving beneath layers of repainting, a wall near a collapsed temple where two lines remained untouched. "Do not bury me where the wind cannot reach." I was a man, let the dust have me, and though they could not trace his face, they felt his presence, not as a king, but as a hum beneath the noise of history, the proof that silence, real deliberate silence, can survive even the loudest empires. In the museum catalogues, he is listed only as unrecorded monarch. In Egypt's long lineage, he is a blank. But in the hearts of those who sleep beneath wind and date palm trees, he is stillness, he is memory, he is question. He is what remains when the gods go quiet, when the stone is lost and all that's left is breath. The stories never stopped. They just changed shape. At first they were careful whispers, then metaphors, then poems, then myths told around small fires outside the city gates, not in royal chambers, not in papyrus archives, but in the minds of those who had been children during the silence. They had grown up under his still reign. They had seen a kingdom ruled without gold, and a garden left untouched while temples rose and fell. Now older, they carried his breath with them into the desert, into exile, into obscurity. One was a stonemason's daughter named Meheret. She had watched the priests tear down the garden wall after his death. Not all of it, just the outer stones, enough to make a point. They left the trees. But they shattered the words. One night, as the stars bled silver over the Nile, she stole into the rubble and gathered the pieces, not many, just what she could carry in a shawl. She buried them beside a grove, beneath sand and quiet. Years later, when her grandson asked her why she limped, she told him it was from carrying words no one wanted to hear. Another was a baker's apprentice. He'd been fed by the Pharaoh's famine reserves. remembered the day grain had arrived, not from priests or traders, but from the palace itself, without price, without blessing. He spent his life teaching children how to bake flatbread with nothing but patience and ash. When asked why he didn't, "Build a shop or carve a sign," he said only, "The man who saved us gave without name. Why should I need one?" They called him Sa-mu, he who belongs to no one. And then there were the scribes, always the scribes. After the silent Pharaoh's reforms, many lost their royal appointments. No more monuments to inscribe, no more divine decrees to polish. So they wandered, found work recording merchant inventories, writing letters for widows, teaching children how to shape words with steady fingers. But they never stopped writing his truths, not on papyrus, not in ink. They carved them into driftwood, pressed them into clay jars, etched them onto the inside of copper bowls sold in markets. One bowl, found centuries later, read, "Not every ruler must raise his voice, some led by listening." The empire changed again. New pharaohs rose, boisterous, divine, forgetful. They raised golden statues that gleamed in the sun. They declared wars for honor, for gods, for glory. They built tombs wide enough to house armies, but none of them could erase the breath, because the breath had scattered. It had rooted itself in memory, and memory in Egypt was harder to bury than a pyramid. A generation later, a strange movement began in the southern provinces. It was not religious, it was not political, it was quiet. Farmers began gathering once, a year not to worship, not to trade, but to sit in silence together under the moon. They called it Hetrenen, the night of remembering. No one led it, no one advertised it, but they came, old and young. Those who had lost, and those who feared loss. They sat beneath date palms, breathed in the warm desert air, and waited for nothing. That was the point. Waiting, without asking, without noise. Some called them mad, others feared sedition. A few tried to outlaw the gatherings. But how do you outlaw silence? No chants, no symbols. Just people remembering a pharaoh who never asked to be remembered. Among those who attended Hetrenen was a woman named Tayet. She was a servant once, in a house near the palace. She had been 13 when the silent pharaoh died. Now 72, she walked each year to the site where his garden once stood, though the trees had withered long ago, and the city had built over most of it. Still, she found her way. One year she brought with her a scroll of linen, onto which he'd written every word she remembered from his reign. Lines like, "Stone is a trap for truths that haven't lived yet. Do not kneel where no hunger exists. Let the wind judge your legacy." She laid the cloth on the sand, then watched it blow away, and she smiled. In time, the memory of the silent pharaoh ceased to be a person. He became something else, a story, shared by musicians in dim corners of taverns, a name muttered by soldiers before marching into battle, a symbol etched into the handles of knives and the backs of mirrors, the sign for breath, stylized to resemble a crown. No one agreed where it came from, no one agreed what it meant, but it appeared, over and over, as if the empire itself had inhaled something long forgotten and could not exhale it again. There were rumors of a priest, one who had served the gods under the loud pharaohs, who left his temple in his 60th year and disappeared into the desert. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he was chasing the wind, but a merchant's son once returned from a far oasis and claimed he saw the priest seated beneath a lone palm, surrounded by wild children, teaching them how to listen, not to gods, not to rulers, but to each other. Centuries later, long after empires fell and new ones rose, a tomb was found, small, unmarked, nearly consumed by sand. Inside were no treasures, no golden masks, no hieroglyphs, only a clay tablet. On it, in script barely legible. Let my story be the pause between louder ones, and beneath it, the breath. There are maps, and then there are the things maps forget. This place, the edge of the Fayum, where sand brushes against half-swallowed stone, was never marked, not in guidebooks, not in tourist pamphlets, not even in the archives of the Tiu. Grand museums that claim to hold Egypt's memory. It was too small, too silent, too empty to matter, and yet it was here, a mound of broken pottery, a half-wall with faded pigment, and a sunken courtyard overrun with reeds. This was what remained, not of a temple, not of a tomb, but of a moment, a breath. He wasn't an archaeologist. Not truly, just a university student, a summer researcher on a fellowship he barely qualified for, sent to catalogue flora, but drawn instead to the ruins no one had bothered to name. The locals avoided the spot, said it was cursed, or forgotten, or both, but he returned every morning, not out of faith, but out of something quieter. Curiosity, yes, but also comfort. There was no noise here, no tour buses, no vendors, no professors peering over his shoulder, just dust, warmth, and the low rustle of reeds that always sounded like they were about to speak. One morning, he found it, a stone, smaller than his palm, wedged in the roots of a fig tree that hadn't grown for 100 years. Smooth dark, unremarkable, but when he held it to the light, etched there beneath centuries of silence, was the symbol. He didn't recognize it, not at first. It wasn't one of the known glyphs, at least not one in the standard textbooks. He rubbed it with his sleeve, thinking maybe it was damage, a crack, but it wasn't. It was deliberate, carefully carved, not by machine, but by hand. By someone who had meant it to last, not through power, but through presence. He brought it to his mentor that evening. The professor stared at it for a long time, said little, then finally muttered something about non-canonical symbols and folk etchings. But the student knew better, because that symbol, that crown of breath, had also appeared in the ruins' courtyard, beneath layers of soot on the interior wall. He had brushed it away gently with his fingers, and there it was again. Cracked, barely visible. But there twice is coincidence. 3 times is a pattern. The more he looked, the more he saw it. Not just here, but elsewhere, on the underside of a copper bracelet in the museum vault, in the margin of a scribbled training scroll from the 19th dynasty. Even faintly, strangely, on a wall in a Cairo cafe, graffitied in modern ink, but matching the old shape perfectly. He started to collect them, not physically, but in photos, in sketches, in a notebook he never showed anyone. He called it the Pharaoh no one named. His friends mocked him, said he was seeing patterns where none existed. But he didn't argue, because it wasn't about proving something. It was about listening, about noticing the way silence wasn't empty, but full of stories that didn't fit into the timelines, the lineages, the dynasties, full of people who ruled by not ruling, spoke by not shouting, and shaped legacies that resisted inscription. The student never found a name, no cartouche, no royal titles, no definitive tomb, but he found the breath, and more importantly, he began to feel it, in the way villagers would pause before walking past the reed field, in the way the cats refused to enter the old courtyard, in the way the wind always rose when he stepped into the center of the ruin. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't magic. It was just memory, soft, uninvited, unforgettable. He returned home at summer's end, published his thesis on indigenous flora, as required, but in the back of the paper, tucked into the appendix, was a small image. No caption, no explanation, just Yule breath. Years passed. He took other jobs, worked in museums, wrote catalogues, labeled hundreds of objects with cold, precise words, but at night he would trace the symbol in notebooks, on napkins, into frost on windows. He couldn't let it go because it had let him in. One day he returned, older now. Not a student, just a man with questions. He walked again to the reed-choked ruin, found the wall half gone, the fig tree dead. But in the dirt where he had once found the first stone was something else. A bowl, cracked, half buried. He brushed it off inside just one line. Let my story be the pause between louder ones. He smiled, because now he understood. The silent pharaoh had never needed a name. He had never wanted one. His was a legacy of breath, of resistance without rebellion, of truth without tribute, and that was more powerful than any pyramid. The man left the bowl in place, did not take it home, did not photograph it. He simply sat beside it until the sun dipped below the dunes, and in that final golden hush, as the desert cooled, he whispered, "I remember you." The wind stirred, and the breath moved once more. Centuries passed, and yet the breath continued, not through monuments or museums, but in smaller things. Things no one thought to trace. A fragment of copper engraved with no known language, discovered in a village that no longer existed. A lullaby, sung in an ancient dialect, whose melody did not match any local tradition. A scribbled line on a stone pillar in an abandoned synagogue in Eastern Europe, carved centuries after the last Egyptian dynasty fell. There was once a king who ruled with quiet. No name, no crown, no demand for memory, just presence. In a monastery high in the mountains of Armenia, a monk once wrote of a dream. He saw a garden without doors, a city without walls, and a man who sat beneath a fig tree, writing in sand. The monk asked who the man was. The man said, "I ruled and no one saw me." He awoke with sand in his palm. The monk never traveled. He had never seen a fig tree. But he painted one in the margins of his scripture just once, and beside it, not a cross but a symbol no one in his order could decipher. In Istanbul, a collector purchased a mirror from a traveling merchant. It was plain, cracked, no frame, not especially valuable, but on its back was a faint carving, visible only when breathed upon. The symbol. She asked the merchant about it. He shrugged. "Old priest's mark," he said. "Protects against vanity." She laughed, then bought it and hung it above her writing desk. Years later, when her home burned, the mirror was the only thing left unbroken. She never wrote about the symbol, but in every book she published afterward, a single character appeared, a silent king. Not as hero, not as villain, just seen there, changing everything by doing almost nothing. In Tokyo, a street mural appeared one day under the railway overpass in Ochanomizu. It depicted a figure in silhouette, seated in the sand, crowned, not with gold but with petals. Behind him, no army, no throne, only reeds. The artist never claimed it, and within a week it was painted over. But commuters remembered. Some said they began to breathe slower when walking past. Some said their dreams felt lighter. Some just started writing in journals again, without knowing why. In Lagos, a spoken word poet took the stage in a crumbling hall. She spoke of silence, of rulers who spoke only when needed, of breath as legacy, of forgotten names that echo louder than statues. At the end of her poem, she placed a small stone on the stage, etched into it. She said nothing more. The crowd rose, but no one applauded. They just stood still, together, for 1 full minute. Then left. In Brazil, a child traced a shape into the condensation on a window during a thunderstorm. Her mother asked what it meant. She didn't know, said she saw it in a dream, where a garden was buried beneath the sea, and a man with a cracked crown told her to write before she forgot. The mother didn't understand, but she took a photo, and years later, when that child grew into a historian, she would find the same symbol on a broken vessel in a Cairo dig site and freeze, because she'd seen it before, on a window, in a storm, before she knew what history even was. In New York, a linguist studying nonverbal communication stumbled on a pattern in ancient Egyptian records. She was trying to track shifts in diplomatic language over centuries, but what she noticed instead was a period, brief, narrow, rarely mentioned, in which decrees ceased entirely for nearly 7 years. No proclamations, no military orders, no taxes levied, and yet no sign of collapse. Trade continued. Cities grew. Temples were maintained. No one documented the ruler, but records of everyday life showed fewer imprisonments, fewer deaths by state violence, more public grain releases. It was as if the state had paused and the people had exhaled. She tried to publish the paper. It was rejected. Too speculative, they said. But she kept the files, and in her journal on the inside back cover, she drew the symbol she had seen scratched onto a single pottery shard in Luxor. No title, just that. It continues. The breath. The hue. Story that never ends, because it was never told all at once, only in fragments, moments, ruins. In a hospital room in Montreal, an old man dying of heart failure asked the nurse for paper. He could barely hold the pen, but when the nurse returned, later, the paper had one shape drawn over and over. No one in the hospital understood it. They framed it anyway, hung it in the palliative wing. A year later, patients began asking what it meant. The staff had no answer, but many said the room it hung in felt easier to breathe in. Some say this is nonsense, just coincidence. Projection, desire for patterns in the dust. But even dust carries memory. Even wind follows paths. Even silence has rhythm. What matters is not whether the silent pharaoh was real in the way history prefers. What matters is that across centuries, his absence kept being remembered, as though the earth itself held the impression of a seated man, and never let the sand quite settle. In a future not yet written, a child will one day trace their finger on a screen, draw the shape by instinct, and ask their parent, "What does this mean?" And the parent, not knowing, will answer, "Maybe it means, listen." Time by now has lost all edges. The present folds into the past curls into the present, and somewhere in that quiet crease between them, he waits. Not in body, not in name, but in the way a scent lingers after a door closes. In the way a room remembers footsteps, even if no one can hear them. The silent pharaoh is not gone. He is just outside the line of sight. There is an old well in the Siwa oasis, overgrown with fig and date palms, its water long dried. No signs mark it, no stories frame it. But once a year, when the wind blows, From the east and the moon is smallest, a low hum is heard. It's not loud, not even clear, but those who hear it never forget it. One man said it felt like his grandmother's lullaby, though she'd never sung to him. A child said it made her cry, even though she didn't know why. A woman passing through claimed she felt someone touch her shoulder and whisper, "Enough now." She had been carrying her grief for 30 years. At a university in Berlin, a doctoral student studying ancient breathwork rituals found a scrap of linen in a mislabeled box. It was brittle, colorless, thought to be from a servant's burial shroud. But sewn into its corner in thread so fine it was nearly invisible was the symbol. She traced it, felt dizzy, then calm. When she looked up, she realized the air in the room had changed. It was nothing. It was everything. On a dry hillside in southern Spain, a shepherd uncovered a stone bowl. Not ancient, not ceremonial, just a bowl. Inside, etched beneath the dust, a phrase in crude Latin, qui non regnavit, he who did not rule, ruled. A man in Tunisia dreams each night of a city made of reeds. No roads, no walls, only open. Spaces where people sit in circles and do not speak, but understand. He draws the city again and again, sells the prints to tourists. One day a woman from Cairo buys one, and when she turns it over, she gasps, because there, lightly stamped on the back, is the symbol she had seen only once before in her grandmother's jewelry box. The grandmother never explained it, just said it reminded her to breathe. In a hospice in Kyoto, a man spends his final days painting water, just water, ripple after ripple, canvas after canvas, no people, no boats, no horizon. When asked why, he only says, because something is underneath. His final painting is smaller than the rest, just a single ripple centered in silence, and in the middle of that ripple, the thinnest suggestion of a crown, not drawn, but left unpainted. Negative space. Absence as presence. Somewhere in Iceland, a musician records an album of wind. No instruments, no lyrics, only carefully captured currents of air from across deserts, tundras, and ruined cities. The final track is titled Pharaoh. It's silent, yet it's the most downloaded piece she ever released. In a kindergarten in Cairo, a child doodles a shape on the blackboard over and over. The teacher asks where she learned it. She shrugs. Saw it when I closed my eyes. The teacher scolds her, but when the class naps that day, every child breathes in sync. No one notices, except the janitor, an old man who once studied ancient languages before the war, made him clean instead. He sees the shape on the board, freezes, whispers to himself in a tongue he hasn't used in 40 years. I thought you were only in dreams. The breath is everywhere now, in code, in rhythm, in rituals never spoken aloud. It does not fight. It does not spread. It does not ask to be remembered. But it is. The Pharaoh with no name rules not by fear, not by edict, but by invitation. If you notice him, you are not cursed. You are not chosen. You are simply quiet enough to see. He does not seek temples. He seeks thresholds, doorways, between thought and sleep, between sound and silence, between life and the memory of it. One final story. There is a tree, deep in the Libyan desert, alone, unwatered, unsheltered. No roots could reach this far, no wind should have spared it. And yet it stands. Its bark is pale, its branches sparse. But if you place your ear to its trunk, some say you will hear a sound, not creaking, not birds, but breath, slow, measured, endless. A scholar once tried to date the tree. It did not match any known species. Its rings were distorted, its leaves unfazed by drought. She took a sample, sent it to labs in 3 countries. No results ever came back. The labs claimed they never received the package. One lab tech said, "We opened the box, but there was nothing inside." The scholar returned, sat beneath the tree and fell asleep. When she awoke, she had written 1 sentence in the sand beside her. She does not remember writing it, but the sentence remains. The Pharaoh still breathes. This is the end, but it is not over. Let your own breath carry him. Let your stillness make room, for in the spaces between stories, the Pharaoh waits, not for worship, not for resurrection, just for remembrance. Thank you for listening. Good night.